Today we'll have two sessions, beginning with a session on different perspectives on development, followed by one on reporting on women and children, and then we'll have the valedictory session today. I have the honor of introducing Professor Dr. Amit Ray on behalf of the organizers. Professor Amit Ray teaches economics at the Center for International Trade and Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He was educated at Presidency College, Calcutta, and at the University of Oxford, from where he received his DPhil in economics in 1988. Professor Ray joined JNU as associate professor in 1995 and became professor with effect from January 2000. In between, he has been the director, Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum, during 2013 to 2016, and chair professor at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, New Delhi, during 2008 to 2010, on leave from JNU. Prior to joining JNU, he held teaching and research positions at premier universities and institutions in India and abroad, including Oxford University, Institute of Economics and Statistics, International Food Policy Research Institute, which is in Washington, D.C., University of Calcutta, Indian Institute of Technology, New Delhi as well. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Public Health, London in 2007. He's been a member, Independent Commission of Development and Health in India since 2008. He also served as a consultant to various national and international bodies, including the Planning Commission of the Government of India, the World Bank, and UNCTAD. Professor Ray is a development economist, and his research has primarily focused on economics of technology and research and development. Intellectual property rights, economics of health, pharmaceutical industry, WTO TRIPS, FDI, and a wide range of policy issues pertaining to India's development experience. He has over 75 research publications, including 6 books and short monographs, plus several articles in reputed international journals and edited volumes. His latest book on What is Economic Development, a comparative performance of Indian states, was co-published by Routledge from London and New York and Social Science Press, New Delhi in 2019. I'm honored to welcome Professor Dr. Amit Ray for this first session on day 3 of the Students' Workshop on Development Journalism, organized by Press Club Kolkata in collaboration with Unicef. Press Club. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. Thank you for this very gratifying introduction. Today I'm going to sort of talk about development. You are all budding development journalists, I gather. So I would like to talk about how an economist looks at development. So what is the conceptual foundation for understanding economic development, how it has evolved over centuries, and you see how currently, what is the most comprehensive manner in which we can understand this process of development. So, everybody talks about development, you know, especially in a federal democracy, in a federal structure. Each state, each region will start talking about their development performance and would say that, okay, we have done extremely well in this particular aspect of development, while others would say that this is not the most important aspect, but we have done very well in this aspect. So, let us try to understand how we can sort of, you know, look at this, you know, I mean, instead of getting confused. So, I'm sure all of us have looked at these huge full-page advertisements in the newspapers, particularly in the run-up to elections, where each state government flaunts their performance. You know, some would say, we have done exceedingly well in health and educational outcomes. Some states might say that, you know, we have done particularly well in attracting investments. some states would say, we have done extremely well in terms of security and safety. Crime rates are low, violence against women is low, riots are low. So each of them would pick and choose some aspect and then portray this as their development achievement. Now, none of these claims are factually incorrect. They are all correct claims. But none of them give us a comprehensive and complete picture of the state of economic development in that region. So it reminds me of that legendary story of the elephant and the six blind men. Each of them looking at one, sort of feeling one part of the elephant and trying to describe the elephant. They're factually correct, but none of them, from the description, it is very difficult for an ordinary person to figure out what exactly is the concept of this elephant. So with this metaphor of the six blind men, let us delve a little deeper into the concept of economic development, which I believe as development journalists, all of you should be aware of. So, the concept of development is rooted in classical economic thought. Although, at that point, they didn't explicitly use the word development, but what they had in mind was very similar to what we perceive or what we look at as development in the modern sense. Okay, so who are these classical thinkers in economics? I'm talking about the founding fathers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Karl Marx. All of them talked about, in their writings, they did have some understanding of the concept of development. Okay, but development economics as a separate discipline emerged only in the post-colonial era, when these huge tracts of the world became independent. The colonies became independent from their colonial rulers, and there was, they were characterized by underdevelopment. So that's when the global scholarship focused exclusively on the problems of these underdeveloped areas and how they can catch up with the rest of the world, rest of the so-called developed world. That is when development economics emerged as a distinct sub-discipline of economics, trying to understand the economic structure, problems, issues, and solutions, exclusively focusing on this underdeveloped world. Now, the concept, of course, was prone to continuous broadening, and I will come to that in a minute. So, when the concept of development or the exclusive focus on development economics began in the 50s and 60s, there was one very easy, ready-made sort of measure which indicated development, and that was per capita GDP. So I'm sure all of you know what per capita GDP is, per capita gross domestic product. In simple terms, how much, what is the value of goods and services produced in the particular country during a period of time, and divide that by the population to get a sense of a per capita availability of the goods and services that are available. And this was used as a benchmark to identify countries which are developed, not so developed, underdeveloped, and so on and so forth. And if you look at the World Bank, division of the countries, listing of the countries, it's like rich, upper income, middle income, lower income, and then they also made a distinction of the developing, which is least developed, and in the upper sort of, end of the developing country. So all these classifications essentially was benchmarked by per capita GDP, or the size of the pie, so to say, the pie referring to the value of goods and services produced in a country. Now, and why this concept suddenly came? Because if you look at the writings of the classical economic thinkers, say Adam Smith or David Ricardo, all of them talked about a process which looked at, what was the title of the book by Adam Smith? An inquiry into the wealth of the nations. All right. So basically focusing on how nations would become more and more prosperous. And of course, that was through a process of a capitalistic market-led development, which is essentially industrialization-led development. So how, all of them talked about how, resources from the primary sector would actually move from the primary to the secondary, the manufacturing sector, from agriculture to industry, and how industrial expansion and the surplus created in this industrial expansion would fuel the process of economic growth and prosperity. That was, broadly speaking, the kind of, in one sentence, the conceptualization, the process of prosperity of nations embedded in the writings of most of the classical thinkers. So naturally, when one thinks about measuring or having a yardstick of development, it is of little surprise that you would use GDP or per capita GDP as the yardstick. Now, that is problematic. And in fact, over time, the yardstick actually moved from the per capita availability of goods and services, which is like average amount of the value of goods and services that is produced in the country per head, as an indicator of how prosperous this particular country is, to focusing directly on the quality of life of people, the well-being of people. So, and first let us, try to, focus on the problems of GDP, the limitations of GDP as an indicator of development. There are many problems. I'm not going to touch upon all of them, but let me try to explain just a few of them. For instance, embedded in the concept of GDP is the amount of goods and services that a country has produced in this particular year, okay, which is available, the per head availability of these goods and services. Implicit in this is that these are the resources which you can consume, and this consumption of these resources will make you feel better, that will augment or enhance your well-being. And that, in a sense, reflects how developed a particular region is. But the problem is, GDP actually doesn't make you cannot say, if I produce this amount in this particular year, the entire amount should be available for consumption. There is a trade-off that you have to do, because, apart from the, provisions for the wear and tear of the capital stock, you also need to expand, the production base for future. And if you want to do that, you must slice out some part of it and do not consume that, invest that. And then, that would entail a trade-off between your present versus future consumption. Now, this trade-off is very difficult to capture when you look at the production of goods and services in a particular year. Okay, this is the total goods and services available. Now, so that's one problem. There are, ways of tackling these problems or countering these problems also, but I'm not going to go into the details. The second problem, which also has a solution, is the problem that if you use GDP per capita as the yardstick, is it amenable to international comparison? So if I say that the per capita GDP of, say a country is $100, and the per capita GDP of the other country, is say $200. Can we say that country B is actually doubly better off in terms of the well-being of the people? Not quite. Why? Because consider this. If you have $100 note in the streets of New York, the amount of goods and services that you can purchase in New York may be different from the exact conversion of these $100 in rupees in the streets of Kolkata. So suppose if you have 7,500 rupees in your pocket in Kolkata, can you say that you are equally well off vis-a-vis an individual in New York with $100 note in his pocket? No, because what $100 can fetch you in New York may be very, very different, and in fact possibly far less than how much a 7,500 rupees will fetch you in the streets of Kolkata. So $1, that is 75 rupees in Kolkata, goes much farther than what a $1 will go in the streets of New York. So therefore, this direct comparison in terms of the official exchange rate will really not give us an accurate measurement of the levels of the development or prosperity of the nations. Okay, so in order to counter that, of course, the concept of PPP, purchasing power parity, is brought in, which sort of looks at a standard bundle of commodities, and the price that you need to pay, the amount of dollars that you need to pay to acquire that standard bundle in the two countries, and then you compare those two amounts as your exchange rate. So for instance, a standard bundle would cost say $100 in say New York, and in order to buy the same bundle, maybe you want to travel a commute for some time, and then have some lunch during the day, or whatever be your standard definition of a standard bundle. How much do you need in your pocket in New York in dollars, and how much do you need in your pocket in Kolkata in rupees? And then you compare these two amounts to get the PPP rate, the purchasing power parity rate. And I can tell you, in PPP terms, $1 is definitely not 75 rupees. $1 would be possibly 20 rupees or 20. I'm just giving you an hypothetical example. There are these official calculations. You can go to the website and go to the internet and get that rate. But it is definitely far below the official exchange rates between rupees and dollars. All right. So that's one way of making an international comparison. But the problem is, what is a standard basket of goods, for an average individual, in New York, may be very different from a basket of goods for an average individual in Kolkata. So again, although you're trying to make a purchasing power parity calculation, it may not be as accurate, So therefore, benchmarking it with GDP or per capita GDP, even if it's in PPP terms, may be problematic. Then the third problem, which I'm going to highlight, is the problem of non-market transactions. So for instance, there are a lot of activities in that economic activities that goes on in a developing world, maybe non-marketed. For instance, caregiving activities, looking after children, looking after elderly. These are mostly non-marketed and unpaid services in the developing world, whereas these services are mostly institutionalized and marketed. In the developed world, you would have professional services for elderly care. You would have professional creche or other facilities for child care. Whereas here, joint family, a child, is brought up, everybody is looking after. There is no, but that doesn't mean that activity of child raising or the activity of looking after the elderly, the child care, the elderly care, these are not happening. These activities are happening, but they are non-marketed, so they don't enter the GDP in certain countries, whereas they would enter the GDP in other countries. So ultimately, if you look at the value of goods and services, there would be some kind of an under or overestimation bias, and hence they really would not be amenable for accurate comparisons. And the fourth and the final, this is obviously not an exhaustive list of the limitations, but I'm just sort of highlighting a select few limitations of what's the problem of looking at per capita GDP. The fourth and the most important, one of the most important limitations is that it gives us an average. Okay, so an average individual earns this, but it does not say anything about the distribution of income. So the extent of inequality of the income distribution in the two countries will not be reflected in the measurement of per capita GDP. So therefore, a society, consider two countries with the same per capita GDP, one with a very, dispersed income distribution. So some very poor and some very rich. Another country with the same per capita GDP, but all clustered close together. The well-being, the prosperity, the development of that particular society would definitely not be the same. All right. And that's clearly not captured in this concept of per capita in the measurement of per capita GDP. Okay. So what are we going to do about it? When for a very quick and workable definition, the focus has always been trying to increase the size of this pie, which basically economists, tend to use the word economic growth. That is the growth of this GDP or growth of the per capita GDP, which is growth of the GDP minus the growth of the population rate, reflecting the process of development. How fast your, size of the GDP is growing, and obviously if it has to be faster than the size of your population in order to ensure that the average is also increasing. So in much of the early literature on development, how a country can actually achieve the process of development, the focus was exclusively on growth. And economic growth and development were often treated almost synonymously. They did understand that, growth merely reflects a particular, expansion of the GDP, may not necessarily be translated into development, but, there was not quite much of a distinction that was made in the conceptual, the theoretical literature in development economics. Okay. Entire focus at that point, the thinking of the post-colonial development policy was industrialization-led development. The overwhelming majority of the developing world decided to adopt a strategy of development which focused on industrialization. So you develop in the manufacturing base. That is how you are going to, achieve economic development, and your society will mimic that of the developed world. That was the broad thinking. And that thinking was rooted in, of course, the classical economic thinkers. And, there is a very famous, piece of research that was done in the mid-1970s by Chenery and Serkin, which actually came up with a stylization of the structural process of structural change of an economy with the process of development. And they said that they looked at a cross-section of countries as they, traveled the path of development, and found that initially countries are predominantly, agriculture based. So their output and employment are predominantly agricultural. as a country develops, the focus shifts from agriculture to industry. So manufacturing is replacing development, and a small segment remains the services. These are the three broad categories of activities that economists try to, sort of categorize. So primary, secondary, and tertiary, or agriculture and allied, manufacturing, and services. So with development, you move from agriculture, predominantly agriculture, to an industrial economy, industrial society, and then in the third stage, you actually become more service-driven society. So that was a stylized fact, and the entire development literature of the 50s and 60s, the overwhelming focus was to see how countries would sort of adopt development strategy which focuses on industrialization and leads to prosperity and growth. Now, this was kind of stereotyping the process of development. Now, what do we see in the 70s? After 2 or 3 decades, even multilateral agencies, the World Bank, everybody focused on increasing the size of the pie, economic growth. That's our ultimate objective. If we have a large pie, then every problem would be solved. It would mimic a developed society. But 3 or 4 decades down the line, people realized that yes, this developing world was trying to move towards industrialization, but still the symptoms of underdevelopment was so visible, so stark, that as though none of these policies, none of these directions really were working. So what's going on? And that's when actually from the 70s, when Robert McNamara was the chief of the World Bank, the focus changed a bit, and then they said that, okay, instead of just looking at growth, why don't we also think of policies to attack poverty directly? Okay, because just by promoting growth, just by having economic policies to increase the rate of economic growth, which is really not working in terms of the visible impact on development, they stark poverty, malnutrition, and underdevelopment, which is completely visible. Why don't we have direct policies to combat the menace of poverty? So with that focus, of course, research on development, conceptualization, everything focused on poverty then. The first thing would be how to measure poverty. All right. So a very crude measure would be defining a poverty line. And how do you define a poverty line? You define a poverty line by saying that, okay, every human being needs certain minimum things to survive. I'm talking about survival. I'm not talking about an average consumption basket. I'm talking about survival basket. All right. And in order to buy this survival basket, how much money do you need? And that is your poverty line. If you earn less than that amount, you are poor, because you do not have adequate resource to buy what is required, the bare minimum essential for your survival. So that's how people kind of tend to define poverty. Now, so you define a poverty line and then see how many people are below the poverty line and say, okay, 20% of the population is poor, or 25% or 10% or whatever. Now, this is known as the head count measure, but there's a problem with the head count measure also, because just take an example. Suppose 100 rupees is the poverty line. Suppose, I'm not saying it is. Suppose it's the poverty line. Now, if my income is 99, I'll be regarded as poor. And if somebody else's income is 40, she will also be, recorded as poor. And somebody's income is 10, he will also be recorded as poor. So which basically means no matter how deep you are in poverty, you are just a number. that's clearly not a right representation. And that also has a very perverse policy incentive, because policymakers would like to show that, okay, I have lifted so many people out of poverty during my regime. Now, how do they show that? The easiest thing would be to lift those in the 90s, to push them out to 100, and your entire poverty percentage head count would change. Whereas if you use the same resource to the bottom 10 or the 40th, then you would need a lot of resources to pull these people up. Okay, so therefore just the head count would not matter. So it, a concept of poverty gap comes in, how much poorer you are compared to the poverty line. That should also feature. And you are just not a number, but you are a weighted number depending on how below you are. So anyway, I do not want to go into details of that. So, but basically the focus of development economics, kind of centered on poverty, directly attacking poverty. Now, one stream of thought which is an offshoot of this approach on poverty, saying that why are we sort of just focusing on poverty and trying to give them income transfers, or trying to make sure that they earn enough to be above the poverty line? Why are we having this income based or resource based approach to give it to the individual? Why can't we define the basic needs of the people and ensure that the basic needs are satisfied? And that's known as the basic needs approach. So instead of saying that, okay, I should make sure that everybody has 100 rupees in the pocket, why don't I, as government, as policymakers, ensure that everybody has access to these basic needs of life? And what are these basic needs? It basically defined in terms of food, housing, clothing, and certain public services. So if the policy focus is to pull people out of poverty, then maybe a more direct approach would be to provide for the basic needs of these people. So that's basically the basic needs approach, offshoot from the poverty. Now, what was happening in the 70s and the 80s, was the developing world, especially the Latin American countries, were going through a lot of macroeconomic turmoils, and the Washington Consensus, the so-called Washington Consensus, which is the global policy making, institutions, like the World Bank, the IMF, coming together with a general prescription of how these Latin American countries in particular, and the world in general, can avoid such macro turbulences. Macro turbulences like, you are having shooting inflation, growth is getting stunted, so all kind, and I really would not have the wherewithal to explain these processes in technical terms to you, but the solution came in the form of certain policy prescriptions that every country was mandated to follow. So, the IMF, for instance, would lend a helping hand in terms of giving them a bailout package so that, they would have certain resources to come out of this imbalance. And in return, the countries were meant or supposed to commit to the certain full policy guidelines, overall macroeconomic policy guidelines, known as the structural adjustments. And one of the key elements of that structural adjustment guidelines was to keep the fiscal deficit under control. Now you can understand, if the policy focus is a direct, no matter whether it's direct impact on poverty, direct attack on poverty, or the basic needs, all of them require fiscal resources to be spent by the government. Now, with this structural adjustment structural adjustment process, being implemented and introduced through the Washington Consensus, obviously, the poverty, the basic needs focus of development policy making went into the back burner a bit. And, people sort of again said that, okay, fine, no, first thing first, we should have macro stability. We can't have imbalances and all that. And then, of course, things would follow, something like that, Meanwhile, this entire concept of development was getting challenged to some extent, and people were quite wary of the fact that, looking at development merely through availability of resources and through consumption may be faulty. Okay? So, Amartya Sen was one of the pioneering authors who introduced gave a slightly different kind of a perspective on development. And what he said was, development is not merely availability of goods and services that are consumed. This is the broad understanding of development that has happened so far. You need to have certain goods and services. That's the size of the GDP, basically. Okay, but according to this approach, this new approach, which is known as the capabilities/freedom, development as capabilities and freedom. This approach kind of, says that, okay, let's not get too bogged down with development just as exclusively consisting of goods and services that are consumed. Rather, development should mean what the individuals in a society are capable of doing or being. Now, so here comes the concept of the functionings. As an individual, there are certain beings and doings that you would like to have. For instance, I would like to be well-fed, well-dressed. I would like, these are all beings, okay, like to be healthy, like to be educated. And then there are certain doings, like I'd like to work. I'd like to educate myself. I'd like to be loved. I'd like to live in a society. I'd like to be safe. I'd like to be able to express my political views. So these are the set of functionings that should ultimately define the well-being or the welfare of individuals in a society. And capabilities approach actually looks at the capabilities are actually the alternative combinations of these functionings that are feasible for a person to achieve. Okay, so in fact, the capabilities approach is functionings are crucial. That's lies in the that's the centrality of the capabilities approach. But it is conceptualized as a reflection of the freedom to achieve these valuable functionings, to be able to do and to be certain things that you consider important for your quality of life, for your well-being. Okay, and that's not where it ends. I'll give you an example. If you look at development only as a matter of consumption, and the fact of consumption itself gives you the well-being, it's a slightly different approach. Why? Think of education. Education is a service that is essentially consumed, but education essentially enables a person to live a meaningful life. So if I just look at the consumption of education and does not consider whether it actually does the job that it's supposed to do, whether I am able to live a meaningful life after being educated, then the whole purpose of this consumption is defeated, right? So that's the approach. So the capabilities approach looks at this being able to do or being able to be, being able to work, being able to contribute to society, being able to live a healthy life. All these functionings should ultimately define, these functionings are of course a function of, the resources that are available to you, how much you make out of it and everything. It's a function of a whole lot of things. But just by looking at consumption, you are not capturing the whole thing. And then there is the concept of freedom. Okay. So you may be capable of doing certain things, or you may be seen to be doing certain things, but whether you had the freedom to choose that particular being, and I'll give you an example. One of the functionings would be, say, starvings. What is starving? Starving is the mirror image of being able to eat, your stomach full. Okay, so you don't want to go hungry. That's one of the functionings that would definitely be at the core of defining your capability bundle, which would define a development. So the converse of it is starving. So you are unable to feed yourself. Now contrast that with the functioning called fasting. So if you fasting is also not eating, starving is also not eating, but they would have very different connotations. Why? Because in one case, you are starving because you do not have the freedom to choose the other function. Whereas when you are fasting, you could have chosen the functioning of eating, but you are choosing not to eat. And you have the freedom to do that. So therefore, again, capabilities, not just the bundle of doings should be observed. Whether you have the freedom to choose from this bundle is also extremely important in defining the well-being of an average individual in the society. That's broadly the new conceptualization of development that started coming up in the 80s and 90s. And given the structural adjustment and a focus away from poverty, the UNDP came up with another, sort of conceptualization or another indicator of development called the human development approach, where they put the human beings at the center stage of understanding development. And this human development approach stated that there are three essential components of well-being for people to lead a long and healthy life. That's the first component. To acquire knowledge, and the second component, and third, to have access to resources for a decent standard of living. So essentially three pillars were identified based on putting the human being at the center stage and saying that, okay, these are the three pillars which are essential for a decent life. Okay? And the idea was rooted in the capabilities approach, but it's sort of a very simplified way of trying to come up with a ready-made sort of a rough and ready indicator of development. Okay, that's the human development. And then since then, the UNDP has been publishing the data on all countries on this HDI, the Human Development Indicator. Now, in 2001, the UNDP further, sort of stated that, look, this is not good enough. Given that we are not focusing on basic needs or poverty or whatever, but there is need, with this capabilities approach and, looking at individuals' well-being at the core of defining development, it was felt that every country there should be, and when you're looking, sorry, I forgot to mention something. When you're looking at capabilities, it immediately, points towards the multidimensionality of this concept. It is no longer constricted to the resources available and the goods and services that you have produced, because a whole range of other things would matter when you're talking about development as capabilities and freedom. So that's where the multidimensionality comes in. The Human Development Report picks up on 3 dimensions, and the Millennium Development Goals actually, the culmination of this multidimensionality was in the Millennium Development Goals, which, was accepted in 2001, and, it sort of set targets for every nation for certain goals to be fulfilled by 2015. Now, most of these goals, so there were like 8 goals and something like 69 targets. 8 goals and 69 targets. I'm sorry, no. It was like 8 goals and 21 targets. All right. 69. I'm sorry, it's not 69. 21 targets, and most of these targets were actually outputs, output goals, such as, reducing poverty by 50%, achieving gender parity in enrollment. These are all outcome-based goals. And the governments were asked that, you focus on these to direct policy intervention to make sure that you achieve these goals by 2015, so that the world looks at least a little more, equal and little more, sort of not so unequal and not so divided, So the entire tract of the developing world should come up to a level by 2015. Now, what happened was, with the progress of these goals, there were many problems. First of all, the goals were, targeted with very specific measurement problems, and it would entail, it would mean, it would require that every country should have a database which is amenable to these measurements. Now, that's not always correct, not always true. Many countries would not have accurate registers of deaths and births and other demographic data or health outcomes or learning outcomes. So these are problematic areas. And so by 2015, the response was very mixed, and the success rates were far from satisfactory, to say the least. So then the UNDP came up with this concept of sustainable development goals, so which basically expanded the range of goals from 8 to 17 with 169 targets. It was, done through a consultative process of various stakeholders globally, and then they came up with this very extensive set of, goals and targets, and expected countries to make progress and, sort of, track the progress on a regular basis. Now, these goals, when you have 17 goals, you can understand anything and everything can be a development goal. So life underwater is one of the goals. Okay. Just to give you an example, you can, look at the internet and see the listing of the sustainable development goals. Now, one of the problems with such an extensive goal setting is that, you can't sort of treat development as one size fits all for all countries. Each country would have different priorities. So poverty reduction would be absolutely important, for certain countries, whereas, maybe marine water, life underwater is, I'm saying, as a global public good, everything is important. But, you cannot put it in a one size fits all kind of an approach. So that's where the sustainable development goes, and that's the latest in terms of the multilateral systems, approach towards development. But now I would actually come to the core of my lecture in the last 10 minutes, which would actually enable you to understand the multidimensionality of development, this was reflected in a report of a commission which was set up by the then in 2008 by the then French president Nicolas Sarkozy, with Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, as the chair of that commission, Amartya Sen as member, and Jean-Paul Fitoussi as the other member. And the commission was mandated to identify the limits of GDP as an indicator of economic performance and social progress, to consider what additional information might be required for the production of more relevant indicators of social progress, and to assess the feasibility of alternative measurement tools, and to discuss how to present this statistical information. So it's like a comprehensive wish list of streamlining the concept of development along the line of the capabilities and freedoms approach pioneered by Amartya Sen, which highlights the multidimensionality of development. Now, I would urge all of you to read this report of the Stiglitz Commission. I would give you a very, very broad and quick outline of their main recommendations. So they identified 9 dimensions of development. Again, please keep in mind this was all a reflection of the capabilities approach. Okay, so capabilities / freedoms approach. The first dimension, yeah. Can you please silence yourself, Nandini Patra? Yeah, thank you. So I'm sorry, I got a bit lost. So yes, I was talking about the Stiglitz Commission. So the Stiglitz Commission identified 9 dimensions of development. The first dimension, of course, is material prosperity. Now, material prosperity, according to the Stiglitz Commission, is not just per capita availability of goods and services. It's not just per capita GDP. Material prosperity extends much beyond, material well-being extends much beyond per capita GDP. It should actually look at individuals' wealth and assets and income rather than the per capita GDP only. Then should look at the consumption levels, should look at certain basic amenities like what kind of housing facilities, how many people have access to pakka houses, what kind of sanitation facilities are available to the population, what kind of drinking water is available, what kind of connectivity, both physical infrastructure as well as teleconnectivity, is available. Because these are all parts of your material well-being. You need proper connectivity through roads, railways, and airports, and what have you. You should need teleconnectivity because you are now in the IT age. This is absolutely crucial. And then, of course, net connectivity is important. And of course, absence of poverty. These are the indicators that one can think of when trying to attack or trying to assess material prosperity as the first dimension. Now, that we have already talked about. Now, what is the second dimension? The second dimension is health. And here I would, again give you an anecdote. When in the great epic Mahabharata, when Yaksha asked Yudhishthira, what is the greatest gift of all? You know what the reply was? The reply was health. No matter how materially prosperous you are, if you do not have good health, nothing matters. Okay. So health is the second most important dimension of your capabilities, the functionings that we talked about, and the freedom. All right. So health can be, measured through all kinds of health indicators, health outcomes like mortality, morbidity, longevity, and all kinds of health, inputs like immunization, health expenditure, health infrastructure, and outcomes like nutritional status. Everything should come under this dimension of health. The third dimension of development is knowledge and education. Now, knowledge is another great asset that augments quality of life, especially in modern knowledge-driven societies. I need not, say any further. And knowledge here is not just education. Knowledge is also knowledge creation. How much of creativity, how much of R&D, how much of other, intellectual property you are generating. Okay, so everything would be part of this knowledge dimension. The fourth dimension, which is a very difficult dimension to measure, but it's a very important dimension, is the personal activity. So we do acknowledge the way the people spend their time, and the nature of their personal activities influence the quality of life and their subjective well-being. Various activities discussed under this domain or this dimension of development includes decent work, paid decent work. You may have a flashy job, but you don't have a decent work, or you have some earnings which, is pushing you out of poverty in terms of the poverty line, but that's not decent work. There is a concept of decent work. So that's extremely important. Then unpaid domestic work. How much time you spend on leisure? How much time you spend on commute? I know of people, youngsters who join, after getting their master's degrees from our departments, they join the analytics firms in the corporate world, and they spend long hours. The day starts at 9 or 10, goes on till 10, 11. Hardly any time to have to themselves. So therefore, this personal activity dimension, what kind of activities span your day, would clearly indicate, but it's very difficult to measure it. The fifth dimension is political voice and governance. So ability to participate in political discussions, public policy making, to express dissent, as well as to pick up against authority on matters that one perceives to be wrong, are essential aspects of somebody was raising hands, anyway, essential aspects of political, freedom. So, and that has a positive value in itself. I would love to live in a society where I'm able to express my views freely, so freedom of speech, political voice is extremely important. And of course, governance, how good, that's also clubbed under this dimension. If I'm wronged in a society, how good is the justice system? How good is the judiciary? How good is the legal infrastructure? All these should be part of the fifth dimension. The sixth dimension talks about social connection. Now, human beings are social beings, so we cannot live in isolation. So no matter, even if we are able to do and able to be, all kinds of, all the functionings are available. If you are isolated, if you are not socially connected, that will worsen your quality of life. So, things like how many close friends you have, what is the marital stability in this society, how many suicides, social isolation do you have? All these would reflect social connections, which is a very, very important component of quality of life. Dimension 7 is environment. I need not say much. I would like to live in a pollution-free, in a clean environment, which is free from air, water, noise pollutions. I should be able to, am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the forest cover, water management, soil quality, everything would come under environment. The eighth dimension is personal security, which is basically how safe I am. Is the society full of crime? If I can't walk freely on the streets, without the fear of being robbed or whatever, then it reduces my quality of life, no matter what my prosperity is. So that's, crime rates, incidents of violence, it could be communal violence, caste violence, domestic violence, all forms of social unrest, violence against women, dowry deaths, deaths due to road accidents, police force, how effective the security and the safety system is, everything would come under this dimension. And the final dimension is economic security. And I would just take a minute to explain this because, you might be thinking, okay, we have already talked about economic prosperity. We have talked about earnings, material prosperity. So what is so if I have a lavish job, in the corporate, that's enough, isn't it? No, that's not enough. Because economic security talks about how secure I feel, how vulnerable I feel. If I lose my job, how much is my job security? If I lose my job, do I have the social security to fall back on? This would be very, very important. I may be earning crores, but tomorrow if I lose my job, that's what happened in 2008 financial crisis. A lot of people lost their jobs. During the pandemic, I hear lots of people lost jobs. Okay, because of lack of economic security. Okay? And this would be reflected by the unemployment rates. Why? Because if you lose your job, how easy is it for you to get another job will depend on what is the rate of unemployment in the society. It would also depend on your dependence on, more uncertain, sectors like agriculture is more vulnerable. So it would depend on how much of the workforce is in the informal sector, which is inherently more insecure. Okay. So what is the population which is covered under social security schemes? These are all indicators of economic security. So in a sense, this completes a holistic understanding of the process of development in its multidimensionality. I stop here. Thank you.
Thanks for this fabulous masterclass, sir. I wish I was a student in one of your classes and during my student days, so things would have been a lot better. Putting everything from Adam Smith to Amartya Sen to purchasing power parity to SDGs and everything. I mean, students will have access to this even after this class. So if you have any questions for sir, you can go ahead, raise your hands. We can have 5 minutes for questions if sir is there. Does anyone have any question? Students, IMC Denkanal, SKBU, North Bengal University, and University of Golbongo students. Anyone? Are you all there? Am I audible? Yes, Lalit, please go ahead.
Good evening, sir. Sir, I am audible.
Good evening. Yes, please tell me.
Sir, I want to ask, जो 1948 का जो डिक्लेरेशन था, यूनिवर्सल डिक्लेरेशन ऑफ ह्यूमन राइट्स, सर वो सक्सेस हुआ है या नहीं हुआ है? अगर सक्सेस हुआ है तो जो यूरोपियन, जो एशियन, जो सेंट्रल एशियन कंट्रीज हैं, उनकी अभी कंडीशन इस तरीके की क्यों है?
देखो, ये तो I am not a Central Asia expert, so I won't be able to answer this question at all. So yes, this Declaration of Human Rights, if you look at it, in the format of the lecture that I presented, that's very much part of the dimension of development that I have been talking about at the end. Okay, so yes, you have connected the issue in the right context, but you have asked the wrong question to the wrong person. You see, I would not have any clue as to whether it has been, how successful it has been in throughout the world, especially in Central Asia, because that's not something that I keep track of. Okay, human rights. But yes, it is a very, very important dimension. So my idea was to expose you to the dimensions of development, not to give you an account of how each country has performed or how each region has performed in terms of their development performance. And as I said, picking and choosing one dimension to denounce one country, it again boils down to the story of the six blind men and the elephant.
On behalf
There
of,
was a chat, somebody,
please go ahead, sir.
is sustainable attainable? Again, you see, sustainable goal development, as I said, you know, it's a huge wish list, and clearly, you know, you would need Millennium Development Goals. I said, you know, they were not achievable because, you know, the targets were also not, you know, put in a manner that was clearly, you know, laid out in terms of a policy direction or whatever, and, you know, measurement problems were there. So therefore, now sustainable development goals are much more down to earth. They do not, you know, have these very, very high aspiring, you know, and then they said that you can set it according to your, you know, it's much more context specific. In that sense, it is more achievable. But the point is, as I mentioned to you, I feel, it's my personal take, that the prioritization of these set of 21 goals, you know, and 21, sorry, not 21, 17 goals, you know, each goal is important, of course, but then every country, every context should have its own prioritization of the goals, you know. Otherwise, I don't see how any particular country would be able to achieve all of them, you know, in a time-bound manner.
Thank you so much, sir. On behalf of Press Club Kolkata and Unicef Office of West Bengal, I can't thank you enough for all your support during all three workshops. And this has been immensely useful for everyone, for the organizers, for the students, and for all of us here. And we hope to receive your support both online and offline whenever you're available. And this is such an important dimension of development journalism, and no one could have done it better than you, sir. Thank you again, sir, for all your support.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you. May I leave now?
Yes, sir. So you can.
Thank you.